Hello, this is Mark Galeotti, Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Institute of International Relations Prague, currently based in London, with another rumination on Russian politics. And this time it's much more speculative than more often. What could possibly connect the potential rumoured extradition of arguably the most notorious gangster currently in Russia's prisons with, in 2016, the appointment of Vyacheslav Volodin to be Speaker of the State Duma, General Whip and sort of political technologist-in-chief in Parliament? Well, I would say these are two bookends to a process that I think we're increasingly seeing as Putin changes some of the fundamental bases of his state and moves from being one with, shall we say, a certain degree of controlled pluralism being harnessed for the purposes of both the optics of the state, but also in order to create some degree of internal marketplace of ideas, and more towards one which we could almost call corporatist, in which everything has to be assimilated into a single campaign. Anyway, let me explain. Let's start with the gangster. The gangster in question is Tariel Onyani, Taro, a Georgian criminal who has spent time sort of out the country, in particular in Spain, which is where he's potentially going to be extradited to. In 2005, when things became a little bit too hot for him there, he returned to Moscow. Very quickly established for himself a reputation as one of the most disruptive and aggressive of criminals there, particularly in his feud with Ded Hassan, grandfather Hassan, another Georgian extraction gangster. So much so that when he was actually arrested in 2009 and then sent to prison in 2010 on a kidnapping charge, this seemed more than anything else actually as if the Russian state was simply trying to reduce the scope for the explosion of a new generalised gang war in Moscow, which could also spread through the country. You've got to remember that although the criminal situation is actually quite, seemingly stable at the moment, there are some serious pressures which continue to risk upsetting the status quo. That's not what the authorities want. Parenthetically, I've said this in the past, I don't like the notion of calling Russia a mafia state because it implies either the gangsters run the country or that the state runs organised crime, neither of which is true. However, what is clear is that there is almost a social contract. In some ways, what the state does is manage the broad parameters of the underworld. And so, as above, so below. Some of the processes that we can see in the underworld also reflect processes we'll see in the upperworld. Now, Onyani, again, such is the nature of his position, such is the nature of the Russian state, he didn't really have much trouble continuing to run his gang, and actually his often quite violent attempts to prosecute feuds and take over businesses from in prison. Apparently, by all means, he was using Skype, actually. Now he is in the Black Dolphin prison in Orenburg region, which is probably the most notorious, certainly the most secure, very draconian regime. So it's interesting to know whether or not he's still able to maintain the same kind of day-to-day control over his gang. Now, he's due to be released in 2020, but that might be brought forward, especially if now we suddenly have the Federal Migration Service saying that actually he obtained his right to stay in Russia, his citizenship, fraudulently, which opens him up to extradition. The Russian constitution says that no Russian citizen can be extradited. However, if they can revoke his citizenship, lo and behold, he becomes open to extradition, and they could send him to Spain. And in that respect, that's quite safe, because Onyani has very much been an outsider. He does not have the kind of cosy relationships with figures within the business and political elite that many of, especially the Slavic gangsters, have. So in some ways, it's not as though he can name names that easily. So they may well want to get rid of him. But again, this would definitely be a change in pattern. Now, either Russia is suddenly becoming a fine, upstanding member of the international law enforcement community, which, especially considering what we've recently seen about their attempts to use Interpol to continue their vendetta against Bill Browder and so forth, I find slightly hard to believe, however nice it would be. I think more likely is, and this is where we have this sort of connection with what's going on in upperworld politics, It reflects a wider pattern of either assimilation or expulsion, that there is no room in between. Onyani is, as I said, a disruptive force within the Russian underworld, and also by his aggressiveness, by the effectiveness with which he prosecutes his business, he's also challenged to the predominantly Slavic gangs that actually have quite a cosy relationship with the state. Now, likewise, I think what we're seeing in upperworld politics, and have certainly since the Volodin appointment, is an increasing sense that actually there is a need to create a single coherent political structure rather than to allow multiple different competing but also complementary strands. One of the interesting things was, for example, the appointment of Alexei Kudrin, the reputed liberal, but liberal in an economic neoconish sort of way, figure who has now been brought in to head up the Audit Commission, which may well become a more powerful body, may well have an important role in future economic reform. But I think it also, in a way, it marked an end to Kudrin's position as a kind of free-floating, government-sanctioned critic of existing orthodoxies and policies, and frankly also Prime Minister Medvedev. There is increasingly little room for mavericks, loyal mavericks, shall we say. And we know that this was not the job that Kudrin wanted, but probably he was basically faced with a choice. Now is the time to decide, are you with us or are you against us? And if you're with us, you take the job we offer you. You don't hold out for something grander. More broadly, though, we see, and in part this is actually because of the impact of Western sanctions, a process of virtual renationalisation, as more and more oligarchs and businesses find themselves dependent upon support, subsidies, specially designed contracts and so forth from the state. We have a process of de-offshorization, again, as people bring their money back, as Putin wanted, but really not because Putin wanted it, but precisely because the West, which was once upon a time seen as the safe place to stash your ill-gotten gains, is now more and more problematic from that perspective. So you might as well bring it home. So one way or the other, I would suggest that what we are definitely seeing is in some ways the creation of a kind of semi-corporatist type state. A Putinist state, a late Putinism, in which this is not going to be some kind of totalitarianism. But nonetheless, there is a sense that now is the time to make your final choice. That so many people wanted to have it both ways. They wanted to have an office in Moscow and a home in Geneva. They wanted to make their money in Russia and then cash it, park it in the West. They wanted to have all the benefits and the perks of being a loyal Putinist, but still the freedom to critique, still the freedom to call themselves, to present themselves as somehow independent. That's not the scope. And to take this back to the role of in the Duma of Volodin, what he is increasingly doing is trying to make the Duma work more effectively. Now, in part, that means we're making it work more effectively for Putin, to crack down on some of the more ridiculous insanities that we have seen, though, frankly, the Duma is capable of generating an endless supply of insanities, so I don't think he's going to have too much success in that. But again, it was above all to create this managed sense. The Duma beforehand, because it has no real importance in reality, was allowed to go its own way. There is no more room for that, I would suggest, under late Putinism. Every element of the state and the parastate structures have to know their place, have to know their role, and have to be ready immediately to put their shoulders to the wheel when the Kremlin requires that. And fascinatingly, this also applies to the underworld. So this is, I think, the process of consolidation, a rather senescent, stagnatory process that I think we are seeing under late Putinism. And what it means is that Putin will be able to more and more consolidate power in his grip, not as if he really lacked that, but on the other hand, at the expense of squeezing out alternative perspectives, squeezing out multiple notions. You will still get the political opportunist saying, oh, I've come up with an idea for destabilising this Balkan country, for spreading some particular subversive message in that European nation. That's going to happen. But within Russia, I think that we are definitely seeing this process of assimilation. And unfortunately, given that Putin is unassailable at this moment, resistance is futile. The Borg state of the Kremlin, unfortunately, will continue. So there's an upbeat note to give you from London this morning. Thank you very much.